It's a hot September day in 1066, and the hastily mustered army of King Harold Godwinson closes in on the Norse host of the legendary warrior king Harald Hardrada. Having formed a defensive shield wall, the Norse invaders grasp their swords and battle axes. Now two iconic kings of medieval history are about to clash at the battlefield of Stamford Bridge. In 1065, there could be little doubt that the House of Godwin reigned supreme under the nominal rule of King Edward the Confessor. The rise of the Godwinsons to virtual dominion of the kingdom can be traced back to the emergence of the family patriarch Godwin as the most powerful noble of the land during the reign of Canute. Initially a retainer of first Ethelstan and then his younger brother Edmund Ironside, Godwin became the trusted lieutenant of Canute following his victory over Ironside in 1016. Marrying the sister of Canute's brother-in-law, he was also created Earl of Wessex, even acting at times as the great Danish monarch's regent. By Canute's death in 1035, Godwin was unquestionably one of the major players of the realm. By 1042, the tenacious Earl of Wessex had survived 3 successions, throwing his support behind the restoration of the native House of Wessex in the person of King Edward, later known as the Confessor. Throughout the Confessor's early reign, Godwin consolidated his family's power. His elder sons created earls in their own right. Godwin also had Edward marry his daughter Edith in hopes of siring a Godwinson grandson to inherit the throne. Yet not all was harmonious between the king and his mightiest subject. As a supporter of the House of Yelling, Godwin had enthusiastically guarded against Edward's bid for the throne back in 1036, even capturing his brother Alfred and handing him over to Canute's son, after which he was blinded and died of his wounds soon after. Edward had lived in exile in Normandy and northern France since his father's ousting from power by Canute, and had become thoroughly Normanized by the experience, even acting as a guardian for the young Duke of Normandy, the future William the Conqueror, during his tenuous minority. Given their dark history, Edward was at best ambivalent regarding Godwin. As an effective foreigner in his own land, he relied on native support and was yet unable to overlook the mighty Earl's complicity in his brother's grisly demise and his initial opposition to his restoration. Matters came to a head in 1051. Edward had spent the initial years of his reign not only courting the support of Godwin and the other major earls, but also installing his own Norman and French supporters to positions of power, most notable among them the first Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumièges. Leveraging enough support to drive Godwin and his family out, it was around this time that King Edward may have promised the throne to his cousin William. However, Godwin was apparently just as influential in exile as at home, and effected a comeback just a year later, forcing his own restoration as Earl of Wessex. Godwin did not long enjoy his triumph, the great Earl dying at a feast with the king in 1053. Yet the death of Godwin himself did not eliminate his faction. Replacing the family patriarch was Harold, who promptly succeeded as Earl of Wessex and proved much more acceptable as a right-hand man than his allegedly murderous father. The 1050s saw an acceleration of Godwinson power that did not go unnoticed by other great men in the realm. Harold's younger brothers rose to earldoms in their own right, with Gurth taking Harold's former earldom of East Anglia, and Leofwine granted a small province of his own. Yet a major promotion was of Tostig Godwinson to the earldom of Northumbria. Elfgar, the son of the Earl of Mercia, Leofric, never sat easy with the rise of Godwinson power, and when Tostig was gifted Northumbria in 1055, he had rebelled and been exiled, even joining forces with King Edward's enemy in the Welsh king Gruffydd. Though ultimately mollified by the restoration of his earldom of East Anglia, and then his succession to his own father's major earldom in 1057, the seeds of mutual hatred between his family and Tostig were sown. By the early 1060s, the Godwinsons held most of the earldoms of the kingdom, so that by Elfgar's death, only his successor Edwin governed as a non-Godwinson. Harold's own direct influence had only expanded with his defeat of, with Tostig's aid, Gruffydd in 1063. However, if Edwin similarly smouldered at the dominance of Harold and his brothers, his own family would soon be presented with an opportunity to even the imbalance. 10 years into his tenure as Earl of Northumbria, Tostig had built up significant ill will towards himself. Having opponents assassinated, maintaining close ties with the ever-present threat of Malcolm, King of Scots, and finally effectively doubling the region's taxes. For the northern lords, enough was enough, and in late 1065, while their earl was absent with the king back south, they seized York and killed Tostig's officials. Appealing to the other great family of the realm, the rebels sponsored Earl Edwin's younger brother Morcar as their choice as Tostig's replacement. Tostig, however, had powerful backing. Not only was he the brother of Harold, but was also the brother-in-law and favourite of the king himself. Of all the Godwinsons, Tostig was held in the deepest affection by Edward. Yet brotherly love would not be enough to save the ousted earl. The rebels marched south, and Harold was sent to effect a compromise and found that his choices were dire. Either he could back Tostig, as Edward willed, and potentially ignite a civil war, or he could accept Morcar as his brother's replacement, casting Tostig aside, but maintaining the peace in the face of hostility from abroad. Harold, of course, chose peace, and an enraged Tostig stormed off into exile, swearing vengeance against a brother who had stabbed him in the back. Meanwhile, a heartbroken King Edward now sank into terminal illness during the Christmas period, and Harold was acutely aware that the wolves would be circling outside of England to stake their own claim to the dying king's crown. A year before the ousting of Tostig, Harold had been embroiled in his own crisis while he had found himself in Normandy as the unwilling guest of Duke William. Whether there because of an accident or concerted effort to free his relatives who were languishing in Norman captivity, Harold had ultimately been compelled to swear an oath to support William's claim to the throne. Back on English soil, Harold likely had no intention of honouring such a promise made under duress, but was not foolish enough either to overlook the obvious ambitions of such a formidable lord. On January 5th of 1066, King Edward finally passed away, though beforehand he had charged Harold with protecting the kingdom, and another tale has Edward vaguely pointing out Harold from his deathbed. For Harold and his backers, these events and his wider support justified his coronation on January the 6th, the same day as King Edward's funeral. Yet though crowned, Harold knew he would have to fight to remain king. Duke William, of course, could be relied upon to be scheming his own invasion, and both the kings of Denmark and Norway had feasible claims to England traced back to Canute. In May, Tostig assaulted the Isle of Wight and raided along the south coast before reaching Sandwich. In response, King Harold marched to confront his brother, prompting Tostig's withdrawal. Opting to strike north, Tostig landed in Lincolnshire. Here he clashed with his hated rivals Edwin and Morcar, who similarly drove him back into the sea. Yet if they thought they had seen the last of an ineffective, if despised, rival, they would be sorely disappointed. Tostig travelled widely in an effort to back his ambitions with overwhelming force. Initially based in Flanders, he had audiences with Duke William of Normandy, as well as Svein Estridsson in Denmark, and finally Harald Sigurdsson, the awesome King of Norway. It was with the final man of the three that Tostig allied his smaller force to, in exchange for the restoration of his earldom. In theory, the exiled Godwinson could not have asked for a better backer. Of the three principal claimants of 1066, Harald of Norway was the most experienced warrior. A physical powerhouse, Harald had inherited sole rule of Norway after the death of Magnus in 1047. He had spent the majority of his reign fighting the Danes, and before that had fought extensively as a mercenary captain under both Yaroslav the Wise of Kievan Rus and then the Eastern Roman Empire. Harald's flimsy claim to England was derived from an earlier agreement forged between Magnus and the long-dead Harthacnut, where both men swore to take the other as their heir, with the first to die to inherit the other's lands, for Harthacnut including his claim to England. Regardless of any real right he had to England, Harald of Norway was not above forcing the issue through might and ore. The king agreed to link up with Tostig later that summer and press their claims with devastating force. Indeed, by the close of August, Harald set out from Norway, his sails filled with the same northerly winds that supposedly delayed Duke William in port. Landing at Cleveland, the Norse army proceeded to raid and then sack Scarborough, before repelling small local forces, as well as a larger force sent by the brothers Edwin and Morcar at Holderness. Having swept aside initial resistance, the Norse fleet entered the Humber estuary, where the invaders were eagerly joined by Tostig and his Flemish mercenaries. Sailing inland to the village of Rickel, Tostig and his Norse allies headed north towards York itself, with around half the total force. It was at Fulford, just south of the city, that they finally confronted a comparable army under Edwin and Morcar. Formed up ahead before the Germany Beck, the two forces had the Ouse to their left and boggy ground to the right, making a head-on battle inevitable. Initially separated by the swollen tributary of the Ouse, the English army under the Earls were local feared units formed around the core of professional housecarl units. If not as experienced as Harald's grizzled warriors opposing them, they were still a formidable bar to the great city beyond. Directly opposing the king next to the Ouse was the division of Edwin. An experienced commander, Sigurdsson likely placed his ally Tostig, with his smaller contingent of Flemish warriors, deliberately across from his hated rival Morcar to provoke a reaction. Anchored solidly against the Ouse on one flank and the marshy ground on the other, the English army was well positioned to take a defensive stance, to soak up the blows of the invaders at their leisure. However, in what is likely a reflection of his relative inexperience, the sight of his rival and his smaller force opposite him proved too tempting a target for Morcar to resist, and as the waters of the swollen beck receded, he charged across, quickly driving his rival back. To the left, Harald Hardrada marched towards Edwin with his larger veteran Norse host, pushing them back from the beck, before eventually fracturing their formation with much blood. What was left of Edwin's men routed towards the safety of York. while Harald halted his warriors and wheeled back south. Morcar's attack had dealt severe damage to Tostig's men, and the young Earl of Northumbria was likely elated at his initial success. Yet spirits were likely shaken and then shattered as the land ravager appeared close by. Closing in to deal the death blow, Harald's warriors bludgeoned a path through Morcar's flank and rear. Pinned between both enemy forces, Morcar's warriors attempted to break out via the marshy territory, only serving to intensify losses, those English dead either being mercilessly slaughtered or perishing in the marsh. Battered and beaten, Edwin and Morcar initially fled to York, which later surrendered to the invaders on the 24th of September. Perhaps at the urging of his ally, Harald spared York, but at the cost of feeding his army and also submitting hostages, in the usual fashion, who would be handed over the next day at a specified place. Returning to Rickel, Tostig must have been in high spirits at the humiliation of his foes, and his Norse ally was one step closer to his treacherous brother's throne. Word had quickly sped south to the ears of King Harold of the Invasion. Throughout the summer, Harold had guarded the south coast against the Norman threat. Having already disbanded the Fyrd, the king took his corps of professional housecarls and marched north, mustering new Fyrd units along the way. In a remarkable feat of speed, Harold covered the 190 or so miles from London to York in around 4 days. Though impressive on the surface, it's likely much of his army was mounted. Whatever the case, this swift reaction proved decisive for his prospects of victory. Hardrada had selected the site of Stamford Bridge for the handover of both the food and hostages. Monday the 25th of September was a hot day, and expecting no imminent danger, Hardrada allowed his men to discard their armor and marched with less than his total force towards the rendezvous. As he did so, King Harold Godwinson and his exhausted army had already arrived in nearby Tadcaster late the previous day. Here he probably learned of the fate of the army at Fulford and of York's surrender. Having briefly rested, the royal army departed Tadcaster around 6 a.m. on the 25th, reaching York some 3 hours later. At York, Harold's presence was still unknown to either those Norse at Rickel or with Hardrada himself. Fully aware of both forces, Harold chose to take on the army under Hardrada himself rather than that of the Norse at Rickel. Following the Roman road via the Gate Helmsley, the English army determinedly approached the invaders. However, remarkably, Harald of Norway and Tostig were still initially unsure of this new force's intent. Back at the battlefield, the invaders held both sides of the bridge, with most of their warriors on the far side. Once the stark reality of their peril set in, Tostig suggested a fighting withdrawal back to Rickel. However, Hardrada resolved to fight. With battle imminent, it was then that a parley ensued. King Harold rode with a small escort of housecarls to meet both Hardrada, Tostig, and their small bodyguard. Since the Norse king understood little English, it was the brothers who exchanged some tense words. Tostig was not only offered the restoration of his earldom, but in addition a third of all England to govern if he turned on his new ally. However, Tostig asked brazenly what Harald of Norway would receive, to which his brother grimly shot back, 7 feet of ground, or as much more as he needs, as he is taller than other men. In response, Tostig rejected his brother's offer, saying he would not have it said of him that he had brought the King of Norway to England only to betray him. Hardrada had not understood the words spoken, but had caught onto the body language of Harold well enough. Following Tostig back to their army, he asked who it was that spoke so brashly, to which Tostig revealed it was his brother. Hardrada angrily retorted that if he had known, he would have slew Harold there and then. The diplomatic niceties set aside, the battle erupted around the bridge, with the smaller Norse vanguard attempting to hold out long enough for their comrades on the far side to form a decent shield wall. If Harold had significant amounts of archers, he may have used them in his attack, though what happens next suggests otherwise, or more indicates a chivalric streak of admiration on part of the English. His comrades either slain or driven back across the narrow bridge, a single unnamed Norwegian Ajax now guarded the passage to his comrades beyond. The bridge itself was certainly narrow enough to be covered by the great swings of his Dane axe, this warrior's blows easily hewing through mail, splintering shields and hacking away flesh and bone. Repeatedly slaying 40 men, the housecarls, themselves deadly axemen, pulled back to offer mercy in recognition of this Norseman's great skill and courage. However, it became all too clear that this Norse, Horatius, had every intention of falling where he stood. Branding them as a pack of cowards unable to overcome but one man, the Englishman lost all patience. Sending a man under the bridge, a spear was thrust up and into the unguarded region beneath the warrior's chainmail. Their tormentor finally overcome, the English now poured across the bridge. The forward Norse warriors had done their work well, as they had held back the English onslaught for much longer than expected. Harald Sigurdsson had pulled his main body back to deploy on some high ground. His battle line was long but relatively shallow, the Norse king having refused his flanks into a circular formation, placing himself under his banner, the Land Ravager, in the centre along with Tostig. Yet despite this, the odds were stacked against them. Outnumbered and mostly without armour, the shield wall was eventually breached, the Norsemen butchered in their hundreds. At this crucial point, Hardrada charged into the thick of his foes, possibly dual-wielding a great battle axe and sword. However, even in his berserker fury, the great Norse king was struck down, the saga stating he sank to his death with an arrow to the throat. The King of Norway's fall would undoubtedly have been a blow to the hearts of his men, though did not cause an instant collapse of his army. A pause in the fighting did allow for King Harold to offer mercy once again to the surviving Norse if they submitted. However, Tostig, ever defiant, merely took up Land Ravager and resolved to fight to the death, which he, along with his Flemish mercenaries, duly did. The blood price exacted on both sides was high, yet even as this latest round of battle died down, a new threat emerged on the horizon. In the moments before the battle, Hardrada had rejected Tostig's call for a fighting retreat, but had dispatched 3 of his swiftest riders to fetch the rest of his army from Rickel. In a feat similarly impressive to Harold Godwinson's own march north, Eystein Orri had led the remaining fully armoured Norse warriors towards the battle, but all too late. To compound the day's misfortunes for the Norsemen, their armour and a hot day exhausted them sufficiently to weaken their attack. Likely pressing some local guides into service, they approached the English from the flank. Enraged at the news of the fall of their king, this final stage of the fighting was particularly ferocious, though ultimately futile, and appropriately called Ori's Storm in the Norwegian tradition. Harold Godwinson had achieved a remarkable victory that day, though at a staggering loss. Chasing the survivors back to their ships, Harold magnanimously offered Olaf, the surviving son of Hardrada, mercy if he gave his oath to leave and never again attack England. If the sagas are to be believed, only 24 of the 300 original Norse ships were needed to ferry the pitiful remnant of the Norse army back to Norway. Meanwhile, Harold not only rejoiced at his victory, but dutifully recovered his brother's battered body, having him buried in York. Alas, Harold would not long enjoy his greatest triumph, as soon after he received news of yet another invasion. The long-anticipated Norman landing had come, and now Harold marched south to ultimately face his destiny at the battlefield of Hastings. If you enjoyed watching, attack the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. Support us on Patreon and get early access to our videos for as little as $1, or click the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.